long before the world knew the word samurai, before armored warriors entered legend, before the name samurai spread fear across the battlefield, there was a time when the samurai did not exist. There were no swordsmen carrying two blades at their side. There were no enormous castles rising above the mountains. And there was no warrior class ruling the country. Japan was governed by the emperor and an aristocratic court in the capital. But beyond the walls of its magnificent palaces, in the distant provinces, a new power was quietly taking shape. They began as protectors of land, horsemen, archers, men who served powerful families. But over time, they would become the most powerful warriors in Japan. They would overshadow the aristocracy. They would create a government of their own. And they would dominate Japanese politics for almost 7 centuries. This is the story of how the samurai were born. In the year 794, the imperial court moved Japan's capital to Heian. Today, we know that city as Kyoto. This marked the beginning of the Heian period. Inside the capital, aristocratic life was elegant and refined. Nobles wrote poetry. They admired cherry blossoms. They held elaborate ceremonies. And they spent years competing for position beside the emperor. From inside the palace, Japan may have appeared peaceful, but that was only part of the truth. The farther one traveled from Kyoto, the more difficult it became for the court to enforce its authority. Roads were dangerous. Banditry was a constant threat. Conflicts over land became increasingly common. Local families competed for fields, for water, and for the right to collect taxes. At the same time, large private estates gained privileges that made it difficult for government officials to control them. Landowners needed protection. They could not wait for soldiers from Kyoto to cross hundreds of kilometers whenever danger appeared. So they began to arm themselves. They recruited men who could ride horses, men who could use the bow, men prepared to fight for a family, an estate, or a powerful lord. At first, they did not belong to one unified class. Some were members of local families. Some had served in government armies. Some were officials who had been sent to the provinces and decided to remain there. Others descended from branches of the imperial family that had left the capital. Their origins were different, but they all understood one simple truth. In the distant provinces, power did not come from a written command. Power belonged to those who could defend their land. And this was the soil in which Japan's warrior class began to take root. When people imagine a samurai, they often picture a swordsman holding a katana. But Japan's earliest warriors did not fight like the samurai shown in modern films. Their most feared weapon was not the katana. It was the bow. Elite warriors of the early period were often mounted archers. They had to control a horse with their bodies, remain balanced while moving, and fire a powerful bow with deadly accuracy. Such skill could not be learned in a few days. It required years of training. It also required horses, weapons, and wealth. A professional warrior could not simply be a farmer summoned during an emergency. He had to spend much of his life preparing for war. On the battlefield, these warriors wore armor, assembled from many small plates. Its design protected the body, while still allowing an archer to move and shoot from horseback. They carried arrows, a long, curved sword called a tachi, and sometimes a shorter blade or other weapons. The tachi was suspended, with its cutting edge facing downward. It was well suited to a warrior fighting from horseback. The famous katana, familiar to us today, became prominent in later periods, but fighting was not their only duty. They guarded estates, protected roads, suppressed rival armed groups, recovered seized property, and carried out the commands of those they served. Warrior groups became connected through family, land, and loyalty. A man might serve the head of a powerful clan. In return, he could receive protection, status, or control over land. Through these relationships, warrior families grew stronger. These warriors were often described as bushi, members of the military class. The word samurai developed from the old Japanese verb saburao. It carried the meaning of serving or attending a person of higher rank. A samurai, therefore, did not originally mean simply a swordsman. It described someone who served a master, a man who fought not only for himself, but for his family, his house, and the person to whom he had pledged his loyalty. As the provincial warriors grew more powerful, the imperial court could no longer ignore them. Aristocrats in Kyoto began using warrior families to suppress rebellions, protect property, and fight in political disputes. But this was a dangerous game, because every time the warriors were called into battle, they gained more experience, more land, more allies, and more power. Among the growing warrior families, two names rose above all others: the Taira and the Minamoto. Both had connections to the imperial bloodline, but rather than remaining within the capital, many branches of these families established their power in the provinces. They gathered loyal warriors, controlled land, and became increasingly involved in court politics. The Taira were the first to reach the height of power. Under the leadership of Taira no Kiyomori, they entered the political center of Kyoto. Kiyomori held high government office. He placed relatives in important positions and connected his house to the imperial family through marriage. For the first time, a warrior family appeared to have reached the summit of political power. But the rapid rise of the Taira created many enemies: discontented aristocrats, powerful religious institutions, provincial families, and, most importantly, the Minamoto. In 1180, political conflict erupted into a major war. It became known as the Genpei War. The name Genpei came from alternative readings of the characters used for Minamoto and Taira. The war lasted for roughly 5 years. It was fought on land and at sea. Towns, villages, religious sites were all drawn into the violence. This was no longer simply a quarrel between two families. It was a struggle to determine who would control Japan. On the Minamoto side, one man was building his power in the east. His name was Minamoto no Yoritomo. Yoritomo was not necessarily the greatest fighter on the battlefield, nor was he the general most celebrated in the later legends. But he understood something more important. Wars are not won by swords alone. They are won through loyalty, land, information, and the ability to organize people. From his base at Kamakura, Yoritomo gathered the warriors of eastern Japan. He promised to defend their interests and recognize their rights to land. In return, they served him as loyal retainers. A new network of military power was beginning to form. By 1185, the war had reached its final stage. Minamoto forces defeated their enemies in a series of campaigns. The Taira were driven westward, carrying with them the young emperor and the sacred treasures associated with imperial authority. The final confrontation took place at Dan no Ura, not on an open field, but at sea. Warships faced one another in violent currents. Arrows crossed the sky. Warriors boarded enemy vessels. And as the battle turned against them, the Taira realized there was nowhere left to escape. Many members of the clan died in the sea. Among them was the child emperor. The defeat of the Taira brought the Genpei War to an end, but the Minamoto victory did more than replace one powerful family with another. It changed the political structure of Japan. Minamoto no Yoritomo established his center of power at Kamakura, far from the imperial court in Kyoto. The emperor remained. The court continued its ceremonies. Aristocrats kept their ranks and titles, but practical authority increasingly rested in the hands of a new military government. Yoritomo created institutions to control and reward his warrior followers. Those loyal to him received protection and recognition. Military officials were appointed to oversee provinces and manage many estates. This became the foundation of the Kamakura Bakufu, the Kamakura military government. In 1192, Yoritomo received the title Sei Taishogun, usually shortened to Shogun. The title had existed before him, but under Yoritomo, it became associated with the leader of an enduring warrior government. The samurai had changed. They were no longer merely armed protectors of distant estates. They had become the foundation of a new political system. Japan now possessed two centers of authority: the imperial court in Kyoto and the military government in Kamakura. The relationship between them remained complicated. Power did not pass completely from one to the other in a single moment, but history had turned in a new direction. The warriors who had once served the aristocracy were now governing the country. The samurai no longer stood outside the gates of power. They had stepped inside. When people hear the word samurai, they often think of Bushido, the way of the warrior: honor, courage, loyalty, and a willingness to face death. But Bushido did not appear as a complete written code on the day the samurai were born. There was no single book handed to every warrior. There was no unchanging list of rules followed by every samurai in every century. Warrior values developed gradually over a long period of time, and they differed between eras, families, and circumstances. For the earliest warriors, their priorities were often practical, defending land, preserving the reputation of the family, serving a lord, fighting effectively, and ensuring that their service was recognized and rewarded. Loyalty was important, but history also shows warriors changing sides, abandoning allies, opposing former masters when their family's survival or interests were threatened. Samurai were human beings. They were not perfect figures from legend. Over the centuries, their role continued to change. During times of war, they served as mounted archers, swordsmen, commanders, and soldiers. During long periods of peace, many became officials, administrators, teachers, and scholars. Ideas from Buddhism, Shinto, and Confucian traditions influenced the way warriors understood duty, life, death, and their place in society. Warrior houses created their own family rules. Scholars and samurai considered what responsibilities a warrior should carry. During the Edo period, when Japan experienced a long era of relative peace, a difficult question emerged. How should a warrior live when there is no war to fight? Thinkers tried to answer that question. They emphasized duty, self-control, education, loyalty, and the responsibility to provide a moral example for society. These ideas contributed to the image of Bushido that is familiar today. But the modern understanding of Bushido was also reshaped after the age of the samurai. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, writers presented it as a shared moral spirit of Japan and compared it with European chivalry. To understand the real samurai, therefore, we must separate history from legend. They were not simply swordsmen searching for an honorable death. They were landholders, officials, archers, horsemen, administrators, scholars, and sometimes ambitious, fearful, and deeply contradictory human beings. It is this complexity that makes the story of the samurai so powerful. The samurai were not born from a sword. They were created by the weakening reach of central authority, by the need to defend land, by relationships between lords and retainers, by generations of conflict, and by an endless struggle for power. They began as warriors in distant provinces. They grew stronger beneath the shadow of the aristocracy. They defeated their enemies in the Genpei War, and under the leadership of Minamoto no Yoritomo, they built Japan's first enduring warrior government. But this was only the beginning, because after winning power, the samurai would face an even greater challenge. How could they keep it? In the centuries that followed, they would fight Mongol invaders, divide Japan among rival lords, build castles, overthrow shoguns, betray allies, and lead the country into the most violent age in its history. The samurai had been born, but their legend had only just begun.